So, good afternoon, everyone. And honestly, this is just a conversation. I do want to thank Marquita and Jeff, ADIM, AWEM, all of you for being here. In full disclosure, I'm fatigued because part of the success of this work is to also take care of yourself, right? So there's lots of data and evidence that talks about the racial fatigue and the battle scars that one endures over the years to try to address very difficult topics of racism, sexism, all the isms, equity, and it takes a long time. So I was in St. Lucia last week, and I got in at midnight and went and got my hair locked, because that's important, at midnight, and wanted to be here to have this conversation, not for me, but for you and for what your goals and aspirations are. I will say I thought that this was tomorrow's discussion until Jeff called me and said, so you're talking on Tuesday, right? I'm in St. Lucia, I don't know what you want me to talk about. But I do want to just first for me, I always give thanks to God, and I'm a strong woman of faith, and to my parents, and and to my dear friend Leon, who is still part of this conversation with us. So everything's on the table. You can ask me anything you would like. I will be happy to share my experiences over the years, and we'll see what happens.
So starting out, I wanted to ask you, how have you remained sustainable? Because this is very hard work. It is very tiring work, and many times without, until recently, there was minimal academic cred even associated with it.
Right.
So how have you managed to sustain this in your career?
So just for context, I started at Emory in 1996. So I've been there going on 26 years, and the goal was not to arrive and speak of and be engaged on the topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion, wellness, and well-being. The questions really were around why weren't there anyone that looked like me there? I was the first Black woman on faculty at Emory, and as many of you are either researchers, educators, clinicians, you ask questions and you want to find out the answers. And so the questions I asked 25, 26 years ago begot more questions, and the sustainability around it is rooted in, for me, the privilege, and I say that as a Black woman in the struggle, I still have a lot of privilege compared to many people who look like me, and on the backs of those who came before us. I am not from America. I was born in Jamaica, but I do understand the systemic, long-standing history of oppression for Black and brown people in this country, and had to learn about this. And so when I think about the journey of those who came before me, it is hard, but it is not that. It's not that. I didn't have family members being beaten or lynched or picking cotton or passing the Middle Passage or having to deal with voting rights. I didn't have that. So for me, when I look at the historical lens of people who died, literally, and we do have our George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery's and others, but the multiple people who died to do the work, this becomes sort of expected for me to do the work, to continue the work.
So one of the questions that actually was asked of the earlier panel that we didn't get a chance to touch on, but given your role within your department in dealing with JEDI issues, it was related to how do we engage non-minorities or non-people of color in the DEI efforts. Should they be leading these initiatives?
Yeah. So it's interesting. I saw a TED Talk by Loretta Ross who talked about this, where if you are a racist, sexist, the first goal is to just not even go there or deal with them. But she really talked about inviting people in, not pushing people out. And inviting people in, it's changing the narrative about, it's not I'm moving your cheese and it's not you against me. It's like what Heather McGee says, so everybody wins if we all win. And I think when we worry about or think about allyship, and is it really allyship or is it advocacy for the injustices that we see? I don't know if anyone knows that I have a Scottish heritage, and I'm not sure you would know that. People make assumptions about who I am just because of how I look. But I have Scottish heritage, and no one's ever asked me about my Scottish background. I'm not sure why, though. But I mean, you know, I do have Scottish roots, and I frame the lens around the empathy of individuals. And if you don't and aren't concerned about me as a person, even though you don't look like me, it really does beg the question, so what are you concerned about? Because I have friends across the land, and we get into real talk about white supremacy, and I had to learn about oppression and, you know, the historical things that we are compelled to learn and unlearn, like critical race theory. I mean, you know, we have to have these conversations in a way that brings people in, so that what our advocates / allies can do is help us raise all boats, because, and I'm not a fan of the word minority, I'm just going to say that out loud. We are historically underrepresented groups. Minority suggests I'm less than, or that we are minoritized, which is what we may be, but historically underrepresented groups really speaks to what it's about. We've been historically underrepresented, so bringing people in to understand those realities, who could say, you know what, we may not have the same ideology, but I can see where you're coming from, can help people perhaps not bristle when we hear words like anti-racism, although we know what that means for those of us who are learned around that, but for people you're trying to bring along, shifting the narrative but saying the same thing to get the outcome you desire may be the way to go.
Okay. So what have you found to be the best ways to engage others in those difficult conversations about race, racism, and social justice?
You know, I practice what I preach. So I invite people in. I bring them to my house, sit down and eat some jerk chicken and drink some rum punch. And we talk about, like, we just have conversations. When I went to my first Jewish bat mitzvah, you know, I went there. So I hang out with the Jamaican folk, the Caribbean folk. That's what I do, right? We are in-group people. And I realized I need to grow into knowing about other people and other cultures. And when I went to my first bar mitzvah, anybody, who's been to a bar mitzvah? Everybody, just about. So this table here has not been to a bar mitzvah in general. You need to go to a bar mitzvah because they get hooked up, right, at 13. It was at the Druid Hills Country Club, and I said, who does this for a 13-year-old? And I went back to my parents, and I told them I got a TV, and I said, step it up. But I had to learn about different cultures and different people, and when you peel back the onion around that, I'm like, wow, we have so much in common, and it's so much fun. We would have diversity potlucks. Food is a very inviting, nurturing, familial reality, and you eat different foods when different people share with different people, have these discussions, and you would find so much richness in that. Several mentees I have were Jewish male who are nothing like me in the sense of our culture and identity, but we learned the very basics of humanity and understanding in emergency medicine, which is where we land and we take care of all people. It really gives us a laser focused around how you do this. Going back to that question, we do this is because that's what we wanted to do. All of this other stuff, yeah, but we want to take care of human beings, right? That's the bottom line, right? Everyone, at least I believe, signed up. I'm going to do emergency medicine. It's going to be hard. I don't know if it's going to be this hard. I didn't know about COVID. I don't know about this, but fundamentally to take care of human beings. And I'm proud to be an emergency medicine physician because we've always lived in that lane, and we've been challenged in that lane, and we've stepped in to be better around issues of equity and inclusion and justice. And we roll up our sleeves and we ask questions and we do research, and so all of this matters. all of this matters.
So in the 26 years you've been doing this work, have you found that you are asking the same questions? And hopefully there are more people listening and invested, or have the questions changed? And if so, how so?
It's interesting, tomorrow when one of my last slides talks about the paper Dr. Leon Haley and I wrote in 2001. And I went back and looked at the paper, and it was the exact same thing that we said 20 years ago and what we should be considering when we think about diversity and inclusion. The questions are the same, but they're nuanced, and they are more provocative in the sense that more people feel comfortable speaking up. I never heard the word racism until a few years ago. I never heard the word white supremacy. People were very uncomfortable even uttering these words in public, let alone in private, but the silence that it invoked, people marched with their feet and would leave and or go do different things. Very fatiguing, very tiring. So some of the things that we talked about back then still apply today, which is around leadership, it's around courage, it's around believing that everyone has their gifts to bring to this narrative of this very difficult work. Emergency medicine is difficult work. We won't sugarcoat that, but how do we, with all the difficulty in the work, not rob people of their essence to be able to do this difficult work, which is where the DEI journey should come, because the more time we spend on something as important as this, I agree with, how do we really get to the root cause analysis of talking with our patients, engaging with our patients, thinking about our patients in a way that can lead to quality outcomes for them, and quite frankly, wellness and well-being for us to do this work. I would do emergency medicine again in a heartbeat. Sadly, that's not the sentiment for many. We see the data, we see the outcomes on burnout, suicidality, all of that. So how do we really look at all of that and see the value of all of that for both the individual and the patients we care for to be able to sustain and maintain over 26 years. But I do have a retirement plan, don't worry, I have a retirement plan. I do, it's called St. Lucia, but I do have a retirement plan. But it's important.
So what do you feel is the biggest stride in DEI we have made over the last 20 years of working on this?
The biggest stride is just talking about it. I remember going to meetings like the National Medical Association or other meetings where, rooms had maybe 10 people. You remember, if that many. Rooms certainly were not mixed with different people to have these conversations. For those who aren't aware, the National Medical Association Emergency Medicine group, Nicole Franks is back there. She was our former chair. That was like the support group for black people, right? Because we were worn out and tired, and we had to find a place where we would go and share and discuss and challenge ourselves, but fill our tanks to be able to come back and do our work. And I've seen over the years that, president of ACEP comes, president of AAEM comes, SAEM comes. We've seen this momentum of individuals who come with all different flavors of who they are to have this uniform conversation about what we're trying to accomplish. So yes, we have a lot of work to do. However, if you think of what it took to get us here, I have no delusions to think I'm going to change this today. None whatsoever. I'm a realist. I'm just here to dismantle the house, put up one brick so that our learners and everybody else coming along can put up their bricks, and we can put up the next brick so that maybe in the next 200 years or less, that we can get to a society in which we can all thrive, even through some of the challenges of what we're trying to accomplish.
Well, kind of going forward from that, if it was your way, what would you say would be like the next steps in kind of moving the needle? Where do we need to be focusing?
Oh, so we need to focus on leadership, right? So there are some people, I'm very clear, who are not very much interested in this work. But the good news is they either die or retire. So you got to hang out, stick it out, and create the next generation of people who can have that. You laughing, it's true. They got to go at some point. Everybody got to go at some point. So don't throw a lot of energy, right? The data says it. Don't give a lot of energy to the folks who are just not going to go there. you try to get people who are there who are at least thinking about it, asking about it, wondering about it, and you usher them into positions of leadership. I would say, even in this role and I'm not a fan of Chief Diversity Officer at all, it just happens to be what it is. I'm a fan really of, creating a bench for the future. And this is a work, in my opinion, Cheryl's opinion, that should be somebody who's been there, done that. There's really nothing you can do to me at this point in my life. I mean, I'm just saying I'm a full professor. I'm doing what I got to do. My boss is right there, love him to death, go hang out at his house. We do whatever. But younger people coming up, it's a lot of work. You and I are at the AAMC GDI meeting. We were just at that meeting earlier this year in March, and the racial trauma that people talked about was really painful. Painful. Where people who were new to this work, and I think the data was about 60% of us have been in this work between less than 5 years in the DEI space. Then you have people like Bernie, who's like, leading the charge, who's been there a minute, and then you got a couple of people. But in general, right, with a title, it really is just a new thing. And even in the new thing, with younger people who tend to be either women or people of color, the stress and the trauma that people shared was pretty painful, actually. And so I would say that we need to know that. We need to talk about that. You need to pause if you need to pause. Yes, I look at Marquita and Ava and all of you who've come up and you've sustained, and I would ask you, how do you sustain, right, in the work that you're doing, and why does it matter, right? But everybody has a part. Everybody's accountable. We'll hear a little bit about that tomorrow. You just have to define in which sphere you will be accountable in, because you don't have to eat the whole elephant. You just got to take a little bites. And once you do that and you get engaged with what that looks like, it opens up your eyes, opens up your heart, it opens up your mind, hopefully, to continue the movement, if you will.
Well, I definitely want to make sure that I'm being very inclusive of the audience. Are there any audience members that would like to ask their questions directly? Dr. Heron?
I'm good with Sheryl, too, by the way, because when you say Dr. Heron, I feel like I got to do CPR or something like that. So Sheryl is more than fine. Cheryl's fine, but thank you.
No problem. Well, I will continue on then. I guess I'll be asking mom.
I want to hear from the young people. Young meaning none of y'all with the gray hair. No shade.
So I know a lot of newer or junior faculty
Yes.
are coming into these, maybe not clearly vice chair roles so
Yeah.
early on, but director roles of DEI and things like that. So where do you recommend their first steps be as they are starting this
Yeah.
in a new career space?
So if, and it's a big if, you have access to somebody at the senior level in your institution who has that role, like a Bernie, who is a vice provost or a chief diversity officer at the larger level, that's where you want to go. Because you need to get allyship and you need to get a council. At Emory, it's me and I have maybe 2 other people, but I have a council of 30 people from different departments who are really vested in engaging in this work germane to their area, right? So we have departments who are serving in that leadership capacity. And with that, I also say leverage your academic currency and publish, and look at ways in which you can make change and make a difference and leverage that to move yourself forward. I think without question, my ability to do what I've done is because I'm a full professor, because I will candidly say that I've been questioned. So you an AOA? And I say, so you're an AOA? So, and why would you ask me that? You didn't ask anybody else in there that got inducted. So I know these subtle microaggressions, racism, and I just, I don't give it life, but I do respond with the query like, why did you ask that? And are you an AOA? How'd you get there, brother? And I ask the same question back. So, I think that we have to call it what it is when we see it, right? And I know in this position I have as young people going into the DEI world, you get your allies and the people who can have your back, right? Somebody's got to have your back. And I know the day I can really retire is when I get, well, tell Sheryl, she'll say something. I'm like, yeah, I will say something, but what about the psychological safety that everyone should feel comfortable to say something if it's not right? If it's not right, it's not right. And it is a very challenging thing in a hierarchical space like medicine. But our learners have taught us that, like I heard earlier, they can step up, they can step in, they can engage, and they can find people who can help them usher in those concerns. So don't do it alone. Don't go out there by yourself, right? Make sure you have somebody that's got your back.
So one of the criticisms of DEI work has been, at least in my career, has been like funding associated with it, or people putting money where the mouth is.
Yeah.
What are some of the ways that you have kind of been able to, I want to say, combat that?
So for the record, I don't have a lot of funding, but I do have a lot of time. So I negotiated that I have 0.6 FTE for my DEI work, and I'm keeping my vice chair's job, and I'm doing this and I'm doing that. So I have to decide what's important for me, and I have to leverage it in the sense of what's important for the institution. So if the institution has vision, mission, and values that speak to DEI, and they want to move from excellence to eminence, which is what we say at our institution, I'm like, we can do that, but how do you want to do that? Because if we want to go drive a Rolls Royce, then I need Rolls Royce money. I don't mind driving a scooter, and that's what we're going to get, but we have to balance that and see and leverage the return on investment. Right now, there's a lot of philanthropy out there. I heard people talking about where people are saying, well, what do we need to do in this DEI space? How long would this last? That's $1 million question. I've seen more black and brown people on TV. I was like, where all these people come from? Newscasters and everything like that. Everybody is into this, let's get into the DEI space. So how do you sustain that? And how do you leverage that in the philanthropic world? Like I'm sitting here thinking, okay, after I speak with our alumni, we're having our first big diversity week in the sense that we're bringing in the voices of the many to collaborate and grow and learn. And the alumni, if you're in an institution that has such a thing, would be very much interested in seeing what you're doing and how they can invest and how they can engage. Partnering with places like the National Medical Association, which will be in Atlanta, how do we leverage that lens around inclusivity for multiple groups? And the funding piece, if, and the big if, is it becomes a part of the metric, i.e. the DEI piece, that's where the leadership comes in, right? And if it's not a part of the metric, then it's not going to matter. If it is a part of the metric and chairs and others are held accountable, then it will need to matter. And I think the good Dr. Pierce said it earlier, people have to step up with their money where their mouth is. I had to negotiate for that 0.6 FTE, right? And I had to say, well, this is what I need staff, I need this, and I need that. And it was sort of a good thing. And right now, I don't know if you noticed, but everybody's looking for a DEI person. Like, I get job offers every day. I'm not threatening anybody, but I could really go work anywhere. I'm not trying to do that. But every day, you've seen every day. Dr. Heron, I said, not today, y'all, not today. But call me next week. No, just no. No worries, David. We good. We good. But we have to know our value. We have to know our value to ourselves, our community, our department. The community clearly sees the demographic shift of how we are much more multicultural than we've ever been. And we have to see the value of that. And how do you bring in that lens so that it's not, this myopic focus on which we're looking, but how can everyone, I want to be a part of that party, right? I want to be in that game so that I can help elevate us all together.
Okay. How do you deal with overt racism? And I'm going to go with from patients and from other providers.
Okay, so, there's, yes, that's a great question. So there's some literature that says, the 5D approach, you can be direct, you can document, you can delay, all this sort of thing. And it depends on my mood, right? If I'm in a good mood, I might just curse you out. But just kidding. No, so I deal with it from strategy. So let's go with the patient. If a patient, and I've talked about this before, has said, I don't want to, and I literally had a patient who said, when President Obama was elected to office, This white gentleman, elderly, came in and said, "Hey, look at that, we got an N in the White House." My poor resident came running over. "Dr. Heron, this patient said we got an N in the White House." And he was like, just matter of fact, like that was okay. So in a leadership position, I said, okay, that's not okay, number one, because everyone looks at you. What are you going to do? What are you going to say? How are you going to respond? So I thought about it. And for me, I used to, back in my day, just react. Now I pause, I think, I reflect so that I can be thoughtful, right? So I went over to the patient. First of all, I said to the resident, "Hey, I got it. I'm sorry that happened. That's so inappropriate. That's not going to happen. I got this." So I went and talked with the patient. I said, "Hey, man, so, what's going on?" He was a homeless, elderly gentleman. He drank a bit of alcohol. And I said, "So, hey, man, you all right? What's going on?" And he said, "Hey," and he was jovial, like it was okay to say that there was an N in the White House. I was like, "Oh, wow, okay." So he wasn't angry. He was just a product of his environment because he was elderly. So I would imagine he was like maybe in his 60s or 70s. So if he's in his 60s or 70s, he grew up at a time in the South where we had segregation and we had all this stuff. So this was a normal part of his conversation, probably with his grandparents, where that was just what it was, right? Because I'm in Atlanta at Grady. And I said, "So if you needed blood right now because you were bleeding out, would you take my blood?" He goes, "Oh, yeah, I'll take your blood in a minute." I was like, "Okay." Now, I wouldn't take his blood, just for the record, but he, and I said, "Wow, why?" He said, "Wow, you're just the nicest person I've ever met." And going back to bringing in, not pushing out, that was one of my first experiences pausing around the framework from which people are coming from. And he was racist, straight up. And I knew that he was racist, and I reset that norm. And he said, "You're like one of the kindest doctors I ever met. Can I hug you?" I was like, "Nah, man, we ain't like that." But I went back and said, "Well, sir, your language you should really not, that's offensive, right?" I just said, "That's offensive." And he was surprised that the N-word was offensive. And I was like, wow, this is crazy. But I used it as an example to show and see that here is a man who was, undomiciled. He drank a lot, and he was misguided in his, well, not misguided, but he was grounded in his framework. So I dealt with it that way. Now, fundamentally, since systemic racism and the deaths and the COVID-19 and the whole thing with xenophobia with our Asian brothers and sisters, we actually have a policy now that we put in place at Emory. So that's a systems level policy that talks about how do we respond to patients who respond to you in that way. The fundamental premise being first do no harm to the healthcare professional who's hurt, right, and distressed, knowing that that was a problem. So it took a year and a half to get the policy together, but that's okay. And now we're in the middle of implementation. So that's the patient bias. From a sort of colleague to colleague, people have gotten a little bit better about their overt racism, although some of the subtleties, like the AOA question, I kind of know where they're coming from. And I just, you can just display discomfort. Like, did you really mean to say that? And I do that in a way that's inviting. So tell me what you mean by that. So when people have to explain themselves, I don't jump to conclusions as to why they said that. Although in my brain, I'm like, man, this is racist. I can't believe it. So I said, so tell me why you said that. Or I've never met a person that could speak so well. I was like, oh, wow, okay. Patient actually told me that once and thought he was giving me a compliment. Literally said, you're so articulate and this. And I was like, what the hell is? So I walked out the room, collected myself, walked back in the room. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, I own a construction company, and the workers who I have are black, and they have an 8th grade education. I said, okay. He said, so I really haven't met anyone who can speak as well as you. And I said, well, you need to get out more, because, we're in Atlanta, and we have Morehouse and Spelman, and we got the HBCUs, and there are a lot of, he said, really? I mean, this was, and, you have your inside voice and the stuff over your head, like, what the fuck is that? because this bubble over my head, I could not believe this conversation. And he was straight up. And then the kicker was, I wasn't married at the time. You don't have a ring on your finger, so I was going to introduce you to one of my workers. That was what his intention was. I mean, that was nice. I mean, I mean, he meant well. I mean, in his mind, he meant well. And I just was sitting here and even I tell the story. I was like, this is insane. But I learned again, and I just sat down, and yes, it was painful to educate him about the fact that there were intelligent black people, and we are educated, and so forth and so on. But then I had to realize, here I am in the deep South with somebody who's not been truly exposed and in his bubble, and thought he was meaning well, and I said, well, so I just helped him out a little bit. So it just depends on what flavor I'm in. Now, we know the data tells us when you're rushed and tired and hungry, you can react. I mean, you will react, right? You will react, you can react, and you can lose it. So I've lost it a couple times, but I had to reset and had to not give anyone the power, because that's what it is. When you give people the power to have yourself react a certain way, which you know is not yourself, don't do that. No one has that much power over me. And when I lost it one time, I went home and cried and apologized. I said, I cannot believe I let this person take me out of who I am fundamentally as a strong woman of faith who is grounded in love. Man, they stepped on a corn, and I said, never will I, and I will try not to abdicate that power to anyone to have over me. So there it is.
So you have seen so many programs and led many initiatives and things like that. What would you say, what's worked? What's worked in terms of increasing diverse faculty, diverse residents, and what's worked in terms of, this creating an anti-racist community?
So I get asked that all the time, and in the earlier session I mentioned this, that while Emory has come a long way, I will in public admit and submit, we had no programs, no policies, no procedures. What we had was a leader who believed fundamentally in people being who they are without any apologies. Arthur Kellerman and then Kate and now David believed fundamentally that people could be who they are. I mentioned this before I became an associate residency director. It was Philip and Arthur, two white guys who stood up and was doing the recruitment. And that year we got 15 men, one of whom was black, and one woman. And immediately Arthur said, oh, this cannot be. This cannot be. Sheryl, I need you to be there. So representation, you hear this over and over. I need you to be there. I need you to stand up. I said, stand up and say what and be what and do what and what do you need? Which representative? He said, all of it, and I won't get in your way. I said, okay, because I play music on interview days and I do things a little different. And he said, I don't like that, but okay, right? He's like, that is so not professional. I said, why? Why is music not professional? And and he said, I don't know, we just never did it that way. I said, okay, well, let's try it and see what happens. And he said, okay. And so we played music, and music is a fundamental thing, because when you play music on interview days, people just let themselves go, and you can look and see who you really want and who you don't. And no, seriously. And people become so comfortable. It's fabulous. And I would just watch, like, nope, yes, nope, yeah, no, yeah. So you become that visibility. So that has worked. So long before, we had diversity statements up like from 2002. This is our value, this is our belief. And we stood there and we meant it, myself, Kate Helper, Philip Shane, and we threw in the wellness piece. This is what we mean, this is what we value. So we put things in place. And then, one thing, and I need to just write it up, is ever since then, I said to our residents, of women and people of color, one of y'all are gonna be chief resident. I don't care, y'all throw dice, I don't care who, but one of you is gonna be chief resident because you have to stand up there. Dr. Heron, we can't stand up there. Of course you can't stand up. I stand up there, so you can stand up there. And so the residents became a part of the narrative for leadership and the future, which then gets baked in, right? So when students come and they see a chief resident who's, black or brown, or a woman, they're like, oh man, okay, that's pretty cool. Okay. So they come in, and every year since, we've had 2 women, and last year we had 3 women and 1 male. And it's been interesting because that fostering of leadership cultivated so early, visually prominent, really speaks wonders. And when I stepped out of ARD, people said, "Sure, you can't leave us. We're never gonna have no black people." I said, "No, we good. Our culture is straight. We good. No worries." Because I'm still here, so you don't have to worry. But I never worried about that because the culture was baked in. And ever since then, it's been that sort of thing. Page 2 for me and my growth was looking through not the myopic lens of just race and ethnicity, but around LGBTQ, around accommodations, around all of the things that make us who we are, the visibility and the invisibility of who we are in our diversity tapestry. And I had to say, man, we're not just one this, we are multiple this, right? And so as we developed and cultivated and engaged in that space, it became even more self-evident that that's how people thrive. So, I don't have to pick being black today and be a woman tomorrow and this one. This is who I am, the whole of it. And so that growth for me, as when I started ADIM, at the same time AAMC was going through, should they move from diversity interest group? Should we include or think about LGBTQ? It was like a stress point. It was like, no, now we got to focus in. And I'm saying, it's not us versus them. It's everybody brings all of who they are, and many boats bring the message forward, right? So that was a growth for me, and a growth with AAMC and for others, which is courage and belief that all of who people are and what they bring matters, all of it. You shouldn't have to decide one versus the other, because you are all of it.
Thank you. So I want to offer the audience another chance if someone would like to ask a question directly, or I will continue to read from the list.
I can just throw up my slides from St. Lucia. We can put on some pens.
I'll just ask a question.
Go right ahead.
Hi.
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the advantages and disadvantages of dedicated DE&I roles versus embedding that work into every role, every division, the different the ways in which that works.
Yeah, so it's a good question, and I remember reading something recently where the outcome of having a dedicated role was strong because it demonstrated leadership, right? And that you sit it, I report directly to the dean, right? So I have his or her ear, which is a positive. So, and what I've also learned is, okay, my voice to then encourage the council and have it embedded in different departments has also been positive, because then there is a strategy of engagement across the enterprise, right? So at Emory School of Medicine, they never had a DEI. I'm the first one in there, even though I've been doing this work with a quote title. There was an Office of Multicultural Affairs, like every medical school, right, for LCME. But this piece of the puzzle came into play this year, like March 1st. Actually, Carolyn Meltzer had it 2 years ago, and that became a part of the narrative. And now I have access. So I'm going to meet with all the chairs, and I have the time, right? So the dedicated role affords you the time, and I would say, okay, I got this, and I will meet with, I've gone to all the councils, what are your stress, what are your struggles, what do you need, how can I lobby, how can I sponsor, how can I advocate? So at the AAMC GDI meeting, for example, in March, nobody wanted to send their faculty. And I was like, what the hell? I said, pony up some money, send the faculty. So we had the largest number of faculty from the Southeast, 11 strong, to come, which interestingly enough, recognition and that engagement, both for the school and for the people who attended, who benefited from the conversation, was invaluable, absolutely invaluable. And so my voice to be able to say, can we work this out, and we can help, with some of the budget, and we can get people there. And it also engaged individuals who are new to this work to see, A, you're not alone, B, there's some ways and strategies to address this thing in a very positive way. C, you can pause and say, okay, I'm time out here for a minute. I'm just going to time out so that I can reset and rethink. And then, of course, think about how you can leverage scholarship and whatever it is that you want to do in this space. So it's a combination of all those things. And quite frankly, I'm a fan of succession planning and creating subject matter expertise or leaders in this space would then leverage the next person to step up and step in a way that they're still doing the work, but then they're going to be further recognized. We now have awards in this space. We now have a lot of things in this space to help elevate the work in the way it should go. The anti-racism piece, too, is now a part of we're baking that into the curriculum. We have a DERA, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Racial Advocacy thread at the medical school level where they're literally going through every aspect of the curriculum, right, to see what's in there, what's not in there, what should be in there, and how do we then leverage that across for faculty and others who will be teaching our students. And so, like I said before, this is a serious journey, and we just have to measure along the way, as we are talking about today. When do you know you're successful? When do you know that you're doing it the right way? How are we engaging? How are we moving the needle? We don't have any black chairs at Emory. Let me just put that out there, okay? There's none, zero, zip, zilch. I'm the only one. David looked in the room. Everybody say, hey, Sheryl, good to see you. And I was like, wow, they're like 0, 0. So do we have work to do? Absolutely. So I sit in that room, and now David's got my back too. David raised the DAI question. Thank you, my love. And, you know, so that's what I do from that level of accountability to continually raise that question, particularly as it's also being raised at the university level, which is now having those same sorts of expectations, right? So that's kind of how we work in it. Hello.
Hi, it's always great to hear from you. So I have a question about unintended consequences and a hypothesis.
Yes.
And I wanted to see your reflection upon this. So just 2 weeks ago, I was having a meeting with someone who did a national study funded by a foundation around the experience of international and foreign medical graduates over the last 5 years. So they had like a lot of data from, I think, 4 rural states, or really dominant states. And the picture was really bad.
Yeah.
And so one of the hypotheses the research team was sharing was that we have focus on DEI in certain parts of the country, not in others, but also this is an easy group to, because the policies have also become restrictive for immigration, J-1 visas and things, that they're facing a lot more challenges.
Yeah.
And my hypothesis was that these things are linked, that there are some areas that we're doing very well in some places, but then there's other populations that we're not looking at, or parts of the country that's not, it's getting worse for them.
Yeah.
So I wanted your reflection, maybe my hypothesis is wrong, but I want you to think.
No, you're right. So there's a dominant culture ideology, right? And the dominant culture is white, you know, all of that is where we're living. I mean, there's no debate about that. Colonialism, that's a fact, right? So the question becomes, what do we do? And I've always asked this question as organizations and institutions to be not a part of the party around how we don't invite and or engage people who are from other countries, IMGs. I know for a fact there's some people who are not even going to look at IMGs for lots of reasons, but how do we really challenge the status quo and look at what that means? It's ironic you ask that, right? I said, because we talk a lot about globalization, right? Oh yeah, we got to globalize and we got to do this and we got to do that. But when the rubber hits the road on how we do that, it's a mixed bag, right? We can go anywhere we want in the world and practice and work and do whatever we want to do, but it's not quite the same on the reverse. So that's a question we have to ask ourselves as an organization, as a specialty, not just emergency medicine, but all specialties, as how do we really want to engage and what will we do to get there so that there's a true sense of bi-directional engagement, looking at the data, looking at the reality, looking at the outcomes, so that people aren't looked at as either second class. I was looking at, reading something today to remind people that the 4 schools in Puerto Rico are actually, you know, certified schools, but people think it's some form. I'm like, what's wrong with these people? This is America, right? So it's continuous education, re-education about these realities, and we in this group have to be the vanguards for that. It's really unfair for people who are IMGs and others to have to fight the boulder uphill by themselves, right? This is the structural organizational lens that we have to decide that we want to address And then how are we going to do that, right? Because we own it too, right? So, hi.
Hi, Sheryl.
How are you?
It's kind of loud. I guess I'm loud. I'm Manny again. Nice to see you.
Hey,
nice to see
Manny,
you,
it's
Makita.
good to see you.
So I have a quick question about something you touched on earlier that scares a lot of us who are new, people, new faculty coming in and really interested in DEI work and health equity. Something you pointed out was you're not sure how long this excitement about it is going to last. So the question for you and also for a lot of the seasoned people here is, how do we make sure this lasts? Or what are the steps we can take in order to make sure that there's continuity and it's not just a fad that next month when something else interesting comes up, everybody steps up?
Well, so, historically it was about diversity, right? Get the numbers, get the people, get the process, get the places. Clearly we're into equity and outcomes and how our patients and how are we collecting data in our electronic medical records and how are we, how are we doing all of this? So you have to do this work and get the data and look at outcomes and link it, and I got Dr. Franks here, who I'm going to let her speak about this in a moment. So I want you to talk about your work in quality and outcomes and all of that and why, come on, Nicole, it's a mutual. No, man, but I listen to her, right? Because everything has to be baked into equity and outcomes, every single thing, right? Because no one should deny or could deny that we all want the best outcomes for our patients, regardless of who they are. And so, what racism and that's been there forever, and COVID-19 and police murders of folks has done is rip the scab off of what's been going on for a very long time, right? So what I'm seeing, which I hadn't seen in a very long time, I was around, if y'all don't know Rodney King, that was my day, where I was just in the middle of y'all know who Rodney King is? Okay, good. Just making sure. I just want to make sure. But that was when I was starting residency back in the day, and I was in LA. And I was just stunned that, this all went down and NWA and all this has been going down for a minute and then it disappeared. But it hadn't really looked at the lens of the words we're seeing now around social determinants of health and equity and outcomes. And so while it's slow, and I have a slide that I'll talk about this tomorrow thanks to Dr. Franks, is remember the genesis of our country and the oppression therein has been around for 200 and something years. So here's a Debbie Downer, spoiler alert, that again, this is going to take time, and we have to trust that what we're laying in terms of the foundation, the social determinant, the consensus conference last year, this conference this year, is building upon what has been already done. Am I thinking this is going to happen in my lifetime? I'm not so sure. It may happen in your lifetime. It may. But what I know will happen is one more brick will be laid, right? Again, this house has to be dismantled and rebuilt. So one more brick will be laid. One more opportunity will be afforded. The critical mass of people of multicultural descents and who they are will be here. People aren't going anywhere, right? So we have to trust and continue to push for that enlightenment engagement so that we can continue to act. Can I guarantee that this will disappear? I can't. What I can do is hope for and believe that what is being put in place now, like the educational curricula that's coming out, the research that's coming out, will have some value and some meaning and some outcomes that we should all be proud of going forward, right? So I can't promise you that. I can't look in the crystal ball, but I am cautiously optimistic that we can see some level of movement going forward, because we're certainly not where we were back in the day. I mean, just by evidence of, at the GDI meeting, that was the largest number of people that we saw in these positions. At Emory, we now have 3 deans, literally in 2 years, School of Public Health, School of Nursing, myself and others who are in the DEI space. So there's this hopeful capturing of momentum that will, again, rise boats up from our learners and our staff and others going forward. So we can only hope.
So we have time for one more question, and I see somebody walking forward.
Oh, hello.
Hey, Sherry, how good. Thanks, Cheryl, for these insights. I really want to build on your analogy of laying one more brick down and one more brick. And so when we look at our institutions and we look at internalized systems that are barriers for people of color, for women, the people that can remove those barriers and who actually build the buildings in our institutions are the boards.
Yes.
The boards of our universities, and we've seen a lot of movement in the business community
Right.
for boards taking a very proactive stance and actually,
Yes.
you know, talking to our boss's boss, who's the dean, and talking to, who will then talk to our boss, who are the
Right.
chairs, to actually leverage this. So this is
Right.
my inter-emergency physician coming out, which is, I don't want to wait till you're dead. Right? I am impatient. That is one of my major character flaws.
Yes,
So
yes.
what can we do collectively to
Yeah.
begin to have greater influence on the people who actually have influence?
So the first thing we got to do is remember to vote, right? So we are in midterm elections. I got to remind people, we are in midterm elections, and we have more power both at the national level, the local level, the regional level to get up, get out, to vote and participate in what we can participate in. I will admit, I was not always a midterm voter. I'll just say that. I don't know how many people in here vote at all the midterm elections. You don't have to raise your hand. But I was not as actively engaged and even speaking about doing this as I am now. I took my parents, God bless them, I said, you need to register in Georgia so we can have you vote. So go Georgia Blue. So we have to really leverage that advocacy piece around what we can do. Now for boards, I believe in term limits, but I'm not in charge of term limits, certainly for chairs and certainly for other leadership opportunities. But those are some of the things that we can think about and engage in. And when you have faculty council meetings and you have things on campus where you can lend your voice, you step up and you step in. Yes, I know it's extra time, but it's worth it to be able to leverage. You might get that right person to listen at the right time. And you're right, I'm impatient too, trust me, and this is all of our Achilles heel, right? I mean, in 6 minutes, 5 minutes, you got a noxic brain injury, you're dead. So I get it, right? But we have to look at how we use our strategy and our voices and where we are and how we engage step by step to be relentless, to be continuous in our pursuit to move this needle. And you're right, getting people prepared and ready for the board and other leadership positions has to be accurate. I said, you know, we're doing all these chair searches. I said, you need an equity consult. So we talk about implicit bias, which you know there's no evidence to say it works, but we do it anyway. But I say, so you do all these trainings. What about who sits in the room after you drop in and then drop out? Do you have an equity consult who's watching the whole step of the way? So you've gotten your implicit bias education. You've talked about how this impacts certain things, and then you leave. So I'm going to meet with them and say, okay, so what did you do with that information? We helped recraft, reorganize your entire recruitment letter. So somebody who can, that's my job, right, to serve as that person, to bring the subject matter expertise to change some things step by step, little by little, so that you don't want, because I have some power, not a lot, but I don't want to turn people off totally. I have to use a strategy to get people there slowly but deliberately to be able to make change. So you're right, Sherry. I mean, you're right. The boards, but again, on our level, they got to go, but we may not. You know, we got to wait. Yes, we got to trust that they'll retire.
Well, I thank you so much. We all thank you for this very rich discussion, and thank you all.